I'll introduce myself as well. So,
Fine, we're ready to start then?
what was that, Brian?
We're ready to start.
Almost, yeah. So,
Just,
yep. You want to start now, Frank, or not?
yep, fine. Hello,
Okay.
everyone. Hello, everyone. I'm Brian Goodwin. I'm the president of the Shropshire Beekeepers Association. And just to give you some indication of where we are in England, we're about 150 miles north of London and about 30 miles from Birmingham. And I'm actually speaking to you from the Welsh borders. I'm just living in Wales, which is a separate principality. It's a rural county, largely agricultural, but with some centres of industry near the Birmingham area. We have about 350 or more beekeepers in Shropshire, and we are largely hobby beekeepers rather than commercial beekeepers. There are a few beekeepers in this country with more than 500 or 600 hives. My task today is to talk to you about the type of hives used in the United Kingdom. And I thought that a little bit of history could be useful for you because we go back a long way in terms of beekeeping, and I'm sure you do too. Beekeeping has been very common in this country for 2,000 or more years. And we have always kept bees in those days in straw baskets, which are called skeps. We call them skeps in this country, and I'm sure you're familiar with that kind of thing in New Jersey. And these were kept largely, not because of the honey, because of the value of beeswax used in candles and for waterproofing clothes and for preserving harness in a largely horse-drawn community. And the honey was used for preparing food and for fermenting alcohol. And in our cities, there were frequent outbreaks of cholera and other plagues in very early years. And it wasn't until very early 1800s that they discovered that, in fact, the source of the cholera was generally the local wells in the towns. And so prior to that, people didn't drink water from wells. They used it for washing and all the other things, but they always drank beer, very, very weak beer, including babies. And so we're an alcoholic nation, and we still are to some extent. And that's a problem for some people, not for beekeepers, of course. The earliest written records of beekeeping in this country go back 1,500 years or more to about the year 680, where there was a monk, the Venerable Bede, B-E-D-E, who lived in Jarrow in Northumberland, which is far further north in this country than us. And he was an educated man, and he had a monastery there, and he wrote books, although virtually no one in the local population could read. And those books were also about beekeeping. And his book about beekeeping is in the National Library in London at the moment, and it's quite interesting. He was a very interesting chap from the point of view of being a teacher or a person who was aware of the reaction of other people. And so instead of writing pages and pages of text, he always illustrated the beginning of each page with a picture. And I think you can see it on your screen at the moment on the left-hand side. And it's a diagram of a skep. And he put it there simply because he realized that if people were reading pages and pages of text, they soon became bored, and their lack of concentration meant that they weren't taking in what they were actually reading. And so he put the picture at the beginning of each page, which we still do, simply to focus attention on what was actually being written about on that page. And that, he reckoned in those days, in fact, achieved a better degree of retention of knowledge. That was quite an interesting thing. So that picture of a skep is a straw basket, and you can see that it's built up in layers or strings of straw, and the entrance is at the bottom. And if you can see it clearly on your screen, you'll see that he's also illustrated bees which were entering flowers. He made one mistake though, because you may not be able to see it clearly. He illustrated some of the bees were flying upside down, which of course we know it can't happen. It's as simple as that. straw skeps are not really very weatherproof. And so they have to be protected in some kind of shelter, or that the outer covering was made up of mud and clay to keep the water out in the winter. And you can see on the right of your screen now a bee house dating from 1780, which is very local to us, at a place called Attingham Park. And that bee house was designed by John Nash, and it was there really to protect the bees themselves, because they are located on shelves which are behind those sort of semicircular arches. There were 2 rows of shelves. It was important for them simply because it was a very large agricultural estate, and still is. There's still over 3,000 acres of land there. And so they relied very much on the beeswax for waterproofing their coarse outer clothing, for preserving the leather of their boots and harness and so on, and also for candles. There's a very exquisite house there, stately home, if you like to call it that, and the decorations within that stately home were absolutely exquisite. And so they never burnt tallow candles or used oil lamps because of the smoke. They didn't want the smoke to affect the decoration. And of course, beeswax candles, if they're properly prepared with the right size wick, they don't smoke. But the most important thing was not that at all. It was the smell of the candle itself. Because in those days, and I'm talking now about the late 1700s, no one used to take a bath because it was too cold. And so they only used to have a bath about once or twice a year. And so the smell of the beeswax candles, when the lord of the manor was entertaining his guests, used to mask the body odor of the people that were standing around. And so they were very valuable for that particular reason. Nothing at all to do with beehives, of course, but just a snippet of use of this information. The straw bees, straw hives and straw skeps were used for many hundreds of years, right up until the end of the 1800s. And some people use them today even. I've got bees in the skep, and we have bees in the Attingham Bee House because it's a National Trust place, or a public, it's got access to the public, and they actually come and visit it and look at bees in that particular place. And there are many examples of bee shelters, or bee bowls, as we call them, in this country. The one on the left of your screen now, it is a skeps on the shelves just outside the kitchen window of a farmhouse. And so they were kept very close to where people were living, and they would in fact be harvesting both honey and beeswax from the shelves, or from the skeps, in the late 1800s and even early in the 1900s. And on the right of the screen are 2 skeps which are not British ones. The entrances to the British skeps are usually on the bottom, between the wooden baseboard and the edge of the skep itself. And the reason for that was that you could put a small stick or a piece of wood underneath the edge and regulate the amount of bee space or wasp space to keep the wasps out from robbing the skeps. Those skeps are German, and the bees have an entrance or access to an entrance halfway up the skep itself. There is a national register of bee bowls or bee hives in this country by the Bee Research Association, and you can look it up on the web and see the photographs of all these bee bowls on the web on the Bee Research Association's website. Some of them are very crude. The one on the left of the screen now were just cavities in a stone wall on the edge of a farmyard. And the bees would be tucked into there, particularly in the winter. They may be brought out into the open air more during the summer months. But certainly in the winter, the skeps would be put into those niches in the wall. The photograph on the right of your screen is linked to the earlier photograph of the Attingham Bee House. This is the inside of it, looking out, and you can see skeps on those shelves inside that bee house. And as I said earlier, they're still used today. They're quite an attraction for the members of the general public. But of course, the general public want to see bees themselves and not necessarily baskets of bees. And so we also have observation hives, glass-fronted observation hives, where the bees are allowed to fly freely through plastic tubes, and members of the public can look at the queen, find the queen, of course, look at the brood, the drones, the worker bees, and see the general life of the bees inside that glazed hive. Skeps were difficult to manage, and the early management was that the beekeeper would creep up behind the skeps and would lift each one in turn to assess the weight. And then they would make the decision on which skep they would take the honey from. And of course, they would always select the large skep, the heaviest skep. And they would then place the heaviest skep over a small, shallow pit in the ground in which they were burning sulfur. And they placed the skep over the top of that on some sticks. And the sulfur fumes would kill the bees and allow the beekeeper to harvest the honey in the beeswax. But of course, that is the worst possible method of animal management, because they were killing off their best stocks of bees every year. And the weak stocks were allowed to go through the winter if they were lucky, and to swarm in the following year, so that the swarms would be collected and put in the empty skeps in which the bees had been killed. So it wasn't really a very efficient or effective method of bee management. It was very haphazard. And the beekeepers in those days didn't understand much about the bees themselves. They weren't concerned with that. Their concern was their harvest, the honey and the beeswax, and nothing else. So they didn't understand very much about queens, although the queen bee had been discovered in this country in the early 1600s. Then, of course, people did start to experiment with wooden framed hives in this country from the early 1800s, from the early 13, 14, 1500s. And that led to the development of wooden framed hives, and it led to, obviously, the development of the Langstroth hive in America in 1851. So that if you could go back, Simon, to the previous pictures, and another one, that's it. Now, later on in the 1800s, people learned how to get rid of the bees in the skeps, or to remove the bees from the skeps without killing them. And it was a crude process again. A simple method was, as in the left-hand picture, they would upturn the skep with the bees in it and the honey and wax in it, so that the open part of it was facing to the top. And they would then balance another empty skep fixed with metal spikes at an angle of 45 degrees about above it. They would drum then on the outside of the skep with their hands, and the vibration of the driving would cause the bees to start to walk upwards, as they always do. And once the queen walked up into the empty skep above, of course, the workers followed her, and in a very short time, they were able to remove the empty skep, which just contained bees on the top, and put it back on the original location so that any flying bees would return to it. And then they would remove the skep, which was full of wax and honey, but with no bees. And that was the simple way of doing it. And the picture on the right of you at the moment shows a skep with randomly built combs made in a natural way by the bees themselves. And they used to put sticks or skewers through the skep just to offer some support to the combs once the bees had made them. Okay, Simon, we'll move a little bit more on. That's it. Oh, you can see a nice picture of me with a typical hive. And in the late 1800s, many hives had been designed during the 1800s, but of course we hadn't discovered the beescape in this country, not properly anyway, until Langstroth discovered it in the 1850s in the United States. And then that idea took on in this country, and people started to make beehives with removable frames and adopt the bee space as well. There was a big move in the late years of the 1800s to design a standard hive, because people were not just making them themselves in their workshops, as they'd done previously, but there was a need for hives to be standardized so that they could obtain spare parts, frames, and that kind of thing easily. And there were several designs, but the one that was adopted chiefly was called the WBC hive, named after the chap that devised it, William Broughton Carr. And you can see a picture on the right-hand side of the screen of some of the WBC hives that I used to keep some years ago. They're quite a nice hive, in fact, as far as the bee is concerned, simply because they're a double-walled hive. They have an outer casing, which is easy to lift off. And if you look again at the left-hand picture, you can see the empty casing there. And inside was placed a rather thinly or lightweight hive itself inside the outer casing. And there was a 2-inch gap between the outer casing and the hive body itself, which is good for insulation and waterproofing purposes. And so that hive was very, very popular in the early 1900s. And it's still used today to some extent, although you'll find that there are plenty of them in nice decorative gardens, and they're used as a feature in a garden without any bees in them. And generally speaking, they're holding Wellingtons and garden tools and that kind of thing, which is a pity. But nevertheless, that's what they're used for now. The problem with them is you've got a double set of parts to store during the winter months, and so you've got to have plenty of space to keep WBCs. And their current cost is at least double the cost of what we now call the national hive, which is really a copy of the Langstroth, but much smaller. And the reason for that was that when Broughton Carr was designing the WBC hive, he designed it around the frames which were used in the 1880s and 90s and were still in use today. And those frames, as we think today, are too small. And the hives that we use today in this country are generally too small for the type of bee that we're using. So he made a big mistake. Instead of adopting the American Langstroth hive, he designed his hive around a frame which wasn't really suitable for the bees that we were using. He designed this particular hive partly for aesthetic purposes so that it looked good and for obviously for the protection of the bees. You can see a modern WBC on the left-hand side, and they do look very nice. That one's got a copper roof, and we don't all have them like that. And then on the right-hand side of your screen, you can see a WBC hive, which has had the outer lifts removed at the top, and one of the inner supers or honey section boxes perched on the top of it. And if you're careful, you can see just the space, a 2-inch space between the outer covering of the hive and the inner box. The bees like them, but beekeepers generally nowadays don't like them. And so in the 1930s, late 1920s and 30s in this country, there was a move to simplify the design of the hive and to get it adopted as a standard hive itself. In this country, we have an organization called the British Standards Institution, which gives approval for things which are considered to be of universal acceptance and best practice. And so the national hive was introduced, and it is based on the Langstroth. They didn't use the Langstroth because in those times, we were in times of unemployment, the national slump or the depression, and it was occurring in America, it was occurring in this country. The Americans are, in our mind, very good entrepreneurs. And so in those days, in the 1920s and 30s, they started to export their Langstroth hive to this country in quite largish numbers. That, in fact, caused a scare amongst the British hive manufacturers. And there was a big campaign then to have our own national hive designed. And as I've said, they didn't redesign it completely because they designed it again around the frames which had been used in the late 1800s, which are too small. And consequently, our national hive nowadays is too small, or the standard hive body is too small for the number of bees or the sizes of the colonies which we're using nowadays. The national hive is the most commonly used hive in this country. And so although it's not really all that suitable, people supplement the size of the brood chamber by adding a super on the top and putting a queen excluder on top of that. So we're using what's called a brood and a half. We then come around to the details of the hive itself. It has a bottom bee space instead of a top bee space, which you use on your hives on the Langstroth and the Gadent and so on. Where are we now? We're coming around now to other types of rather less common hives in this country, and that is hives which don't have frames at all, or the top bar hives. They're becoming very common and popular in this country now, not amongst conventional beekeepers, of course, but amongst the population who are more concerned with supporting the ecology, nature, and wildlife in the countryside. And they know that these are pollinators, and so they want to keep these, but they don't want to actually take them apart, and they're not really interested in gathering honey or anything else from them either. And so they use these top bar hives, which just have a small single bar stretching across an open box, which either might be straight-sided as the one on the left-hand side, but more commonly has a hive body which is at 15 degrees angle, because if you construct a hive body with a 15-degree angle, the bees do not attach, or at least they're less likely to attach their combs to it. And so you can lift the combs out. And there is a picture coming up in a minute or two where you will see a picture of a comb from a top bar hive. You can see it's got no side bars or bottom bars. The big disadvantage of it is, of course, it holds a considerable amount of honey, which weighs quite a lot in weight. And if you then twist the comb on its side to try and look at any brood, generally speaking, the comb becomes attached from the top bar and ends up on your feet. And the bees are crawling up your trouser leg. So that's not really a very good way of doing things. So the top bar hive is very popular in this country now. And there has also been an import from France called the Warre hive, which is a very tall sectional hive, which appears to have supers on it, but it is completely top bar. And the bees almost always attach the combs to the side of the supers. That doesn't matter too much because although these pseudo beekeepers don't want to be keeping the bees themselves and looking in the hives, they have a removable panel in the side with a glazed front so that they can look at each level of the hive to see which parts of the hive the bees are occupying. And that's how they get their interest. The one big disadvantage to these top bar hives is that you cannot effectively manage swarm control. The simple reason that it's difficult to take the combs out and to examine them and to locate queen cells and perhaps to remove queen cells. And so these beekeepers are constantly at war with their neighbors because they have swarms, not just one swarm from a hive per year, but probably a prime swarm and several cast afterwards, which go over the hedge into their neighbors' gardens or down their chimney pots and cause quite a lot of aggro. So it's quite a problem for those beekeepers. And they tend to then want to find out more about beekeeping and look us up on our website. And then they end up coming to our apiary in Shrewsbury, where we have about 40 hives. And generally, they, in fact, adopt the traditional beehives, which we all use. And that makes it much easier for their neighbours to tolerate what's going on, particularly if you give them a few pots of honey. So, to sum up then, skeps, still in use, still quite exciting to keep, still very interesting to keep, and in fact many beekeepers still make skeps out of ordinary straw and coil it up together and bind it with briar bark so that they make rather pretty or very nice looking skeps, which we always have on display at our honey show each year. We have a large annual honey show where it's called Shrewsbury Flower Show, which has about 50,000 visitors. We have a large marquee We have over 1,000 exhibits in our beekeeping section, including observation hives. And we have a cage outside with an occupied colony, which is then opened at periodical periods through the day so that members of the public can see beekeeping actually taking place. The cage has got an open top. The bees are flying out quite freely. The members of the public don't realize that the bees are flying above their heads. So they think that beekeeping is very easy and you don't get stung very often, and it's very easy for them to become involved. And so we do recruit quite a lot of people each year at our annual show. And so beekeeping is increasingly popular in this country, and the numbers of beekeepers has trebled in the last 10 years, simply because of the ecological concerns that we have here, because of intensive farming and so on. And so we've got a bright future ahead of us for beekeeping in this country, and I think that we're all very optimistic about it. That's about all I've got to say about the actual hives themselves, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
If anyone has questions, put it in the chat, please. Then I will read those to Brian. Brian, thank you so much. That was very interesting. We have 2 questions in chat. The first one is, what are the skeps made of?
They're made of straw, wheat straw. It's not so easy to make them these days because we're using dwarf height wheat in this country, and I expect you are too in the US. Years ago, the wheat used to be much, much taller with longer straw strands on it. So they're just simply made of straw, and you gather a handful of straw about the size of your fingers together, and you have a hole of about 1.5 inches in diameter. You then put that around the straw and pass it through a tube of some sort. The traditional tube used to be the horn of a cow, which used to be larger at one end and smaller at the other. And you'd shove the straw into the large end and push it through, and the horn would concentrate it and compact it into a tight, rather solid sort of cylindrical package. And then you would strip, or you would have done previously, strip the bark off wild roses, which is very pliable and strong, and you would then wind that around in loops about 2 inches apart, and that would very securely keep the straw in position, and it would last 100 years.
Gotcha.
Many straws. Yeah.
Here's a question: Is Varroa a big problem in the UK? And if so, what do you use to control it?
Yes, Varroa is a big problem. We're using oxalic acid, basically, both using the trickling method and the vaporization method, which you're probably familiar with. There are Philistines amongst beekeepers in this country, though, myself included, who haven't treated for Varroa for 15 years, and my bees are not suffering. I haven't got as many colonies as I used to have, but I know that the bees have Varroa, but they're able to deal with it. And there is a wider movement in this country now among beekeepers who feel that the treatment we are using isn't necessary unless it's a last resort. Obviously, I monitor for Varroa in my bees throughout the season. And if there was a tremendous drop down of bees onto our removable floors, which showed that there was a mass infestation, I wouldn't use any treatment at all. But that being said, I'm in the minority. And the vast majority of beekeepers, the vast majority of beekeepers treat their bees in the winter during periods where there is none at all or less brood. And they're using, as I've said, oxalic acid by trickling it between the combs in a liquid form, and we're using it by vaporizing the oxalic acid with an electrically charged vaporizer shoved through the entrance.
Great. And what kind of honey is produced in your area?
What kind of honey? Well, we don't have vast acreages of single crops as you do probably in the US. You have what we call oilseed rape here. You call it canola, I think, in the US. Is that right? No?
Yes, it is. Yep, it's canola. Or rape. Yep.
Yeah, rape, that's right, oilseed rape. There is quite a lot of that in this country. but not grown in very large areas. And I mean the areas of the fields. We've still got field system, which could be 5, 10, 20 or 30 acres in size. And it's grown in small quantities like that. We get good harvests from it, no doubt about that. And many beekeepers rely on the oilseed rape to be their main source of honey during the summer months. But of course, bees will travel for 3, 4 or more miles away from their actual home, and they will harvest honey from the hedgerows. We have hedges around our fields composed of hawthorn, briar, and that kind of thing. And there is a lot of flowers and wildlife in the hedges around each field. And so our bees will be gathering honey from those as well. And we have lime trees, tilia that is, lime trees growing, horse chestnuts, beech, oak, and other trees, which also provide a source of nectar. And I'm going to talk later on, of course, about heather honey, which is a subject in itself.
Yeah. So 2 questions together I'm going to ask. The first is, what are the dates of your nectar flows, like from when to when? And then also, because you talked about rape, that are pesticides on agricultural crops an issue?
Yes. Our nectar flows start really at the end of April, although you can get a very good nectar flow in May and June and early July. And when you come to the end of July, generally our plants in this country have finished flowering and they're all set for seed. And so there is little or no honey in August itself, except the heather honey, which I'm going to talk about shortly. And so you can get very large quantities of nectar coming into the hives over a 6 or 8 week period in the summer months. And we rely on that for the bulk of our honey. As for treating crops, yes, neonicotinoids have been commonly used on the continent, in Europe, and in this country for many years, but they have been recently banned for the last 3 years in this country. And so farmers are not allowed to use neonicotinoids, which do the most damage to crops in this, because of the systemic methodization. Being systemic, it means the neonicotinoid is put in the seed itself. When a seed germinates in the ground, the neonicotinoid is not on the outside of the plant, it's already on the inside. And of course, it's then taken into the nectar, and it has a disastrous effect on the bees themselves. The oilseed rape also has sort of beetles which affect it, and those are sprayed if there is a heavy infestation. But spraying, again, is carefully controlled in this country. Farmers have to be trained in the use of the preparation of the sprays and the adjustment of the equipment that they use, and they have to keep meticulous records of the sprays used and when they are used, so that if there is a loss of bees during the summer months and it is reported to our government departments, they can check up on the local farmers, come along and inspect their records and find out which farmer has been using that particular spray and would be very heavily fined.
Wow. Here's a good question. What kind of smoker fuel do you use?
Yeah, that's a good one as well. Traditionally in this country, we've used corrugated brown paper, corrugated cardboard packaging material. But with its development over the years, they've incorporated fire retardants in it, so it doesn't burn as effectively as it used to. And so I personally use pieces of rotten wood in my smoker. I find that they are less acrid or more acceptable to the bees, but they have the same result. They do subdue the bee. But we're moving also, in addition to that, to water sprays. I don't know whether you've tried this in the US, but we use a simple hand sprayer, which you can buy for a couple of dollars or less, I suppose, in a do-it-yourself store. Fill it with water, and then when you open up the bees, just spray it lightly over them. And of course, the moisture will start to block their breathing tubes or spiracles along their sides, and they're more intent on cleaning each other's spiracles or breathing tubes out than attacking us. And it's a very, very effective way of subduing bees.
Hmm.
Having said that, I'm a traditional old-fashioned beekeeper. I always like the smoker because I've come across situations where no amount of smoke or water will subdue bees if they really mean to get you.
Gotcha. Here's that most of the bees that we have here in New Jersey are Italian.
Yeah.
So what type of subspecies of bees do you generally use?
Well, there are beekeepers in this country who favor what is called the British black bee. I personally don't think that it exists, but there are darker bees, and there's no doubt that we do use a darker colored bee than you do in the US. We're familiar with the Italian bees because in my early days in the 1950s, we imported a lot of Italian bees into this country, and they are very, very docile. They were imported for use not just by beekeepers, but into schools as well, so that when they were being examined by pupils in schools, the chances of getting stung were not very high. So they're a very docile bee. Generally speaking, the black bee is much more aggressive. And we have to be much more careful in the way that we handle our colonies than possibly you are in the US. And I know that we have a question coming up about that because when you look on YouTube, whatever it is, and see Americans demonstrating their beekeeping, very often they've just got a veil, they're in a short sleeve shirt, and they're wearing their shorts. We don't do things like that in this country. We have suits of armor to keep our bees in so that we're well protected.
Tim Schuler, who's going to be presenting later this morning, he was a New Jersey bee whisperer for us. He's going to be talking exactly that topic. He has a full presentation on how to get to your t-shirt only. So.
Yeah, it's interesting with the black bee that you mentioned, because I know it's also been called the German bee, the Nordic bee, but it's all the same thing. And that was the first bee that the colonists brought here to the US until we start bringing Italian queens over in the mid 1800s. Here's another good question. Are hive beetles an issue?
Hive beetles, no, they're not. And they're not widespread in Europe either. There are some hive beetles in southern Italy, and they in fact, if they are detected in a particular area, then they kill all the colonies in that area to try and eradicate them. And they have been partially successful, but they're still getting the occasional outbreak each year. But hive beetle, no, it's not common in this country. Is it in the US?
Yes, and like in the southern states, it's really a problem. I mean, we do have them here in Jersey, but they don't destroy hives like they do in warmer climates.
Right.
But I'll be happy to send you some.
I think that we generally would be protected by our climate as well, because our climate in this country can go down to -10, -15 or so quite easily in the winter, and that might in fact protect us to some extent.
Great. Well, Brian, I want to thank you so much for opening up this first transatlantic bee meeting. So thank you very much. I'm going to, at this time, turn the meeting over to the New Jersey State President, Isidore. And so Isidore, it's over to you. Thank you so much, Brian.
Thank you.
So let me start sharing my screen, make sure that's working. And do you see that screen?
Yes.
Okay, so again, greetings from New Jersey to everyone, and let me introduce myself. I'm Isidore Venetos. I'm a New Jersey Beekeepers Association president, and I'm a certified master beekeeper from Cornell University. Been doing beekeeping for about 11, 12 years now, and I'm very excited to being in a joint meeting with the Shropshire Beekeepers, and I'm going to go a little bit through the history of beekeeping, and you've provided plenty of questions, and that's what drove the presentation and the format itself. And hopefully, everybody enjoys the presentation from both New Jersey and from Shropshire. Okay, with that said, I'm going to start, and let's see if this works. Okay, so first of all, we're 10 branches, and if you heard us this morning, there's representatives from New Jersey throughout the state, South Jersey, North Jersey. Our mission really is to promote all aspects of beekeeping, kind of educate the general public as much as we can. And obviously this is part of it as well. So we opened up this meeting to non-New Jersey beekeepers as well, just for information purposes. So with that said, let's have some fun talking New Jersey beekeeping, which I'm always willing to do, and most beekeepers are, okay? So I'm gonna do New Jersey 101, kind of giving you a lay of the land of what New Jersey is, and where we're at, and historical ties to Shropshire itself, which was a little surprising. But we're also going to give you a little bit of an overview of the impacts of beekeeping in terms of demographics and population density, land use. And what you're going to see is, for a small little state, we're very diverse in all these elements. And that's why somebody in the north part of the state is going to be doing beekeeping very differently than the person all the way on the southern end. So, so where is New Jersey? We're in the northeastern part of the United States. Latitude is often an indicator of climate. The UK is a little bit different in terms of the Gulf Stream flows, but you can see that we're at about average about 40 degrees latitude. And our northern border is 48. So you guys are well north of our northernmost border in Maine, as long as you don't count Alaska. So with that said, we're also a fairly small state from an area perspective. It's, essentially 115 kilometers wide. And you can see that the very narrow part, it's almost like 2/3 of that. And we're only about 240 kilometers long. And we're going to talk about basically the aspects of New Jersey. And so for those that want to know more about New Jersey, you can actually visit this website, visit nj.org, and there's plenty of information about the state, okay? So how do we tie into the historical side? So, it turned out that the Italian explorers had first arrived in the area. But more importantly, in the 1600s, the Swedish, Finns, and Dutch basically set up settlements and had huge colonies throughout the New Jersey, New York area. As a matter of fact, Manhattan was actually very much a Dutch colonial element. So it turns out in 1609, though, John Hudson, an English sea explorer, came down the Hudson River. That's the Hudson River today is the New Jersey, New York border. So when you look from New Jersey into New York or vice versa, you're looking across the Hudson River, which was named after John Hudson. Sir George Carteret was given a land grant from Charles II back in the 1640s. And he promptly renamed New Jersey. So we're called New Jersey due to Carteret. And we became the 13th American colony, which was ruled by the British. So until 1776, when we declared independence, and New Jersey became actually the crossroads of the Revolution. A lot of revolutionary battles were fought here. There's a lot of historical sites from between the British and the Americans, and Philadelphia, Trenton, Princeton, New York were all contentious points for this revolutionary element that took place. And then finally, in 1876, we were given the name the Garden State, which you still hear today very often, okay? So Shrewsbury is actually located on both sides. So it turns out that you have Shrewsbury, UK, which is the county town of Shropshire with many markets. And it turns out that we also have a Shrewsbury, New Jersey in Monmouth County. And it has direct historical ties to England, and my understanding, Shropshire itself. So that was one of the most old landmarks that we currently have in New Jersey. Which dates back from 1702, and the chapel is still there. And there's still a lot of old buildings in that township itself. Okay. So entry to the New Jersey state, it comes through Newark Airport, and you'll see obviously the welcome to New Jersey, the Garden State. And then you'll look it around and you'll say, well, how the heck is this the Garden State? You're looking at refineries and heavy industrialization. And you'll see, New York City across the way. So what you see is essentially the entry is not so much of a garden state, but a very metropolitan industrial area. So that brings us sort of the beginning of our beekeeping discussion. If you look at the red, these are very high density populations. You have New York City to the right of Newark, which is our largest city in New Jersey in the Northeast. And all those red areas are very, very populated. And we also have Philadelphia, which is another major city, which actually is very relevant to the story of beekeeping. And based on the questions from Shropshire, I will be going through the history of New Jersey fairly quickly. But that's a real important point about Philadelphia that we're going to talk about. Okay. So from beekeeping, land use is very, very important. Again, red is very much developed, but as you can see, there's a lot of green, which is forest, agricultural, which is yellow, and there's blue, which is wetlands. So you can see already that we are very diverse from a very urbanized area to a very rural area. We also have, in beekeeping though, in urban areas, so that we don't exclude urban areas from beekeeping itself. And what I show here is that we also have a very long shoreline, and we're going to talk a little bit about the differences in the state, but we continue also to know that from a flat sea level perspective, if you go to the northwestern part of the state, the elevation is at 1,800 feet. So we have a very drastic difference between the southern state, which is very rural area, and then the Northeast, which is very populated from an urban perspective, and then you continue into the Northwest, and it has rural areas that are kind of high in elevation. And then we go back into the southern New Jersey side, and you'll see large farm tracts, and then finally, there's also an area known as the Pine Barrens, which you can see is a protected area, and hence it's very green. It's an area where it's anything but barren. It's very rich in wildlife, but it also has one of the largest water reserves in the country. So it's very well protected, and the pines are the predominant trait when you go through the Pine Barrens, and hence its name, Pine Barrens. So here's climate and geography. So if you look at it, I already said, there's basically between minimum temperatures, you can see there's an 8°C difference. And so you can see again, as you go away from the ocean and up to the elevations, you can see drastic temperature changes over the year. And the other part of this is that the bedrock, the geological formations of the state also vary drastically. So we have the wetlands and estuary and bogs along the ocean. We have flat and sandy soil, predominantly in that tan area that I'm showing there. And then farming actually starts to really improve because you start getting silt and clay soil in that green area. So that really becomes almost the farm belt for New Jersey. And then finally, you start going into the elevations and you start seeing granite and limestone and shale, which is often associated with higher elevations. So the takeaway from this is basically we're very diverse in climate and geography, and the phenology is actually impacted of that. And you even heard this morning how the folks in South Jersey are seeing the silver maple bloom buds kind of getting ready, and they're swelling and ready to pop out. So they're talking about that Cape May area down in the south here, versus I'm located in Monmouth County, and there's nothing but snow, and nothing's close to blooming right now, other than the fact that I'm waiting for mid-March to bring me some tree blossoms. And I did see that snowdrops, which are a plant, and skunk cabbage are blooming currently. So as soon as the bees can fly, I'm sure they'll start bringing in those sources for nectar and pollen. All right. So again, from a beekeeper's perspective, that impacts our honey harvest. So it impacts, what type of blooms you have, what type of bloom timing. And finally, it also, you only see that the swarming starts in the southern part of the state, while the northern part still hasn't experienced it. So you almost see the transition of swarming as it goes up from south to north. So going now into the specific questions of Shropshire, from Shropshire, is a history of beekeeping, okay? Now this is gonna be a really fast version of it, but I tried to pack it in as well as I could. So it starts out with Lorenzo Langstroth, which you obviously know from the Langstroth hive that was mentioned in Brian's presentation. What he found in 1851 is bee space. So what is bee space and what does it provide for us? So if you look at bee space, what it says is if it's more quarter inch but less than 3/8, the bees will not build comb in that space. That fact alone, the fact that he figured that out, allowed us to have these removable frames. Unlike the skep that Brian was showing, these skeps were now transitioning to these movable frames, and it allows us to inspect the bees for disease, allows us to manipulate the bees to try to control swarming. So there's a lot of advantages to being able to have these movable frames. Also in New Jersey, and Tim can speak to this later, I believe skeps are illegal because you have to, by our regulations, be able to inspect the bees and have removable frames. So boom, there was a big, discovery in 1851. So every beekeeper should remember 1851. It basically set a bunch of entrepreneurs, inventors, and scientific study and ag colleges and commercial visionaries all looking at what? Beekeeping. It started a new industry, essentially, being able to have those removable frames. It was a big thing to do. And so what we see is in the early days of exploration, there was diversionary beekeeping. You'll see that the early beekeepers were essentially religious leaders, physicians, and innovators. But the religious leaders and the physicians had time, which was critical. Obviously, if you're working in a factory trying to support your family, you didn't have a lot of time to play with the bees. So this diversionary beekeeping was very important. So modern beekeeping management in New Jersey and other parts evolved through 4 stages that I'm going to go through right now. So first part was obviously in 1851 was exploration, trying to figure out what is this bee space going to allow us to do. We have these small farms and non-migratory hives, and now it's kind of exciting to figure out where can we go from there. And so that entered the golden age. Again, these religious leaders and physicians and innovators really through the early part of the 20th century, we're experiencing this new understanding and trying to be as innovative as they can in beekeeping. So they were leading themselves towards an early version of commercialization with large scale crops. So if you read a lot of the early 1900 books, you'll see them talking about clover and alfalfa. And having large farms and gathering honey from them. So that was the early commercialization part. They really weren't talking about migratory aspects yet, all right, which is interesting. But the commercial era finally led into a full commercialization in the United States, where it was no longer just non-migratory hives, and it was no longer small farms. It was large scale crops, migratory hives, often in a monolithic or monocultural area, where, for example, every year for the almond crop, a lot of beekeepers, the commercial beekeepers, bring their hives to the almonds in California in order to get them pollinated. So this is where the commercialization went. And then we finally have the 4th phase, which is a darker phase, where we introduced the mite, which you can see on the back of the bee. And that has brought a lot of issues for the commercial beekeepers as well as the backyard beekeepers in trying to control disease and vectors of disease, which these mites tend to spread fairly rapidly. And sometimes I feel that we're almost no longer purely, beekeepers, we're mite managers. So that's a little frustrating element, which again, they started in 1987 with the mites here. Okay, so new beekeeping terms. So when you think about this, I want to give you a feel of, okay, now with these new technologies are coming in, it's going to bring a new vocabulary. So as Brian showed us, they had comb honey, but they didn't have various elements that were required. So bee space basically forced the concept of foundation or wax foundation. That's the foundation that is put into the frames, and then the bees draw out the comb. And you had, in 1857, you had the foundation roller actually come out, where you actually take wax and you press it through that roller, and you come out with wax foundation, which was later used to be put into those frames. Okay. So new beekeeping terms also were honey extraction or extracted honey, and honey extractor, which is on the left. It basically put the honey into this tub, you spin it, and you extract the honey. And that was done in 1870 in the United States. There were earlier inventions in Europe that did a similar function, but it wasn't until the 1870s really that we actually in the United States had a commercially viable honey extractor. So in comb honey, I put comb honey here as a new term because it was no longer just about skeps and cutting out comb honey from the skeps. It was now, how do I produce comb honey in my removable hives? And I'm going to talk about the pinnacles of the New Jersey or beekeeping in the United States. All these terms were basically new terms, in terms of the beekeeper in the 1850s. In smoker itself, we discussed the importance of that, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. So we realized that Lorenzo Langstroth was key to bee space in inventing essentially modern beekeeping. So that happened in 1853. He published A Hive and the Honeybee, and I'm going to talk about the Beekeeper's Library in a little bit. But essentially, what you're going to see is an interesting little story, because the question was, how does New Jersey beekeeping relate to beekeeping in general to the United States? And you'll see this oval shape that I have here was really the driving engine for beekeeping. It essentially drove the innovation that was required and the entrepreneurship that was required to make this industry. So Johannes Marion, we talked about the comb roller already and what foundation is, 1857. And there was a new individual that was now transitioning his hives from the 1840s, where he used large comb honey from skeps, and he now is transitioning quickly to this new way of beekeeping. So this new beekeeping and the mysteries of beekeeping explained, he published the same year that Langstroth did his book, and that became essentially a Bible that was published well into the 1900s in the United States. In order to make this happen, though, you really need entrepreneurs. So you had these inventors, you had these, prophets, or these folks kind of promoting beekeeping. Charles Dayton out of Illinois was from France, and he was an inventor, but more importantly, he became a large publisher and supplier. He invented the publication of American Bee Journal back in 1861, and that became a major source of information for this industry. So you could see how quickly from 1851, 10 years later, you have a supplier and publisher for this new industry, which is quite remarkable. Later on, he was joined by Amos Ivis Root and the Root Company, and he wrote the ABCs in bee culture, and that also became another mainstay for information. But he also wrote the Gleanings in Bee Culture of Bee Culture for Americans, and those two documents from magazine perspectives were very important. They're still today, and I'll talk about that. So finally, you had Charles C. Miller, who wrote in the 1900s, he wrote 1,000 questions or answers to beekeeping questions in his 50 years of beekeeping. And so he also became the driver for comb honey production. But more importantly, he became the honest broker in these magazines or these journals, telling people what was working and what was not. He was a very trusted source. He was trusted by Dadant and by Root and Langstroth as well. So these were really the early pinnacles of American beekeeping. Charles Dadant also formed a strong relationship with Langstroth, and he actually started publishing revisions to the Hive and the Honeybee. And you'll see today the Hive and the Honeybee is actually still available from Dadant Corporation, and that relationship never faded. So I'm just going to do one more chart like this, and then we go through it. I mentioned the extractor, and Peabody out of Massachusetts was basically, responsible for transitioning that from Europe. And now we started seeing commercial queen rearing, which, if you think about it, that's a big step. That was allowing you to reproduce quickly to many hives. And scientific queen rearing was a real new novel item. And what they did here with Doolittle, which you often hear the Doolittle method still today, is grafting bees, which is taking essentially small day-old larvae and creating queens from that larvae. So he wrote the book, and Henry Alley also wrote a book for non-grafting methods. So these two individuals were very important to queen rearing in the United States and still are throughout the world. In 1880, we started seeing agricultural colleges. In addition to just inventors, now we see ag colleges picking up apiaries. And A.J. Cook actually wrote a book, Cook's Manual on the Apiaries, and that's still available in print today. And as we go through, we also start seeing first scale, large scale, successful migratory beekeeper in Florida, out of all places, where Oscar Ogden Poppleton was putting beehives on boats and going with the honey flow or nectar flow in Florida. So he's credited with the first migratory beekeeping. And finally, Charles's son, Camille Dadant, essentially became the largest supplier of World Comb Foundation by 1890. And he established the Dadant Hive, which I believe is also related to the national hive that you use today in the UK. And that was including some of Quinby's modifications. So, and then finally we have Pellet, who's an author and editor for the magazines. Cornell University in the early part of the 20th century. Anna Comstock became a leader in the nature study movement. So the Backyard Beekeepers, she wrote a simplified version for beekeepers to really be able to keep bees. So that was kind of her credit. And finally, for creamed honey, for those of you that love creamed honey, Elton Dice, which is a Dice Cornell lab, which is a beekeeping lab, which still exists today. He's the one that invented how to make large scales of creamed honey. So you see this innovation corridor amongst the Midwest and the Northeast, and Quinby founded the Northeastern Beekeepers Association, but the demand for queens and packages increased. And so that kind of drove queen rearing operations away from the North into the South, which is what is still done today. A lot of our queens come from the South in Florida, Georgia, and other states. So, but later we also started bringing in queens from California, and even internationally we started bringing in bees from Australia and New Zealand for queen packages. So if you were the happening beekeeper in the 1850s, you would have Langstroth's Hive and the Honeybee, you'd have Quinby's books, you'd have these two magazines, and that were based on data and AI. So you're really happening back then. But later in the 1800s, you would have then included the ABCs of bee culture and these queen rearing books that we mentioned earlier. What's interesting is that, like I said, these magazines and these publications are still relevant and still being updated by the Dadant and others. So, and they still keep their roots to Dadant and AI root. And the same thing with these books, that it also is being updated, and you still can get all these books, online. So if you want more on American beekeeping, these are some of the references that I would use, okay? All right, now for questions on feral bees and New Jersey bees. So what's interesting about honeybee races, and we kind of mentioned Italians this morning, for those of you who aren't really big into beekeeping, you're probably kind of chuckling, well, what do you mean by Italian bees, right? Turns out that we have 30 subspecies. There are geographic variants for the honeybee, for the European honeybee. And so as you go through it, each one of these bees looks a little different, and they have different traits. So you often hear Africanized bees or African bees, and nobody wants African bees. Well, why? Let's go through some of the traits. They're common on the combs, but they're very defensive in terms of their behavior. So they'll sting you up. And obviously a beekeeper doesn't want that. They don't collect honey. They have very little honey. So, and they don't winter very well, which is fortunate for us northern beekeepers in the United States. So just looking at these three traits, you could see which bees you probably would like and which ones you would not want. So the ones for defensive behavior are obviously desirable. And it turns out once you start going through the beekeeping world in the United States, the Carniolan and Italians became the most favored bees because they produce a lot of honey and they were not defensive. So with that said, I'm going to go back now to the 1600s real quick to say the original bee, though, that came to the United States was the northern black bee, as you see on the left. On the right is the typical Italian queen. You can see the distinct differences. In the mid-1800s, like I mentioned, they started transitioning away from this black bee to this Italian and other breeds, races. So Carniolan, Caucasian, Buckfast. We also had, and I'm not going to go into detail, an inbred hybrid program that actually occurred back in the 1960s and 1980s. And so you'd hear Midnight and Starline breeds that were being promoted for productivity and temperament. But now we're starting to see something interesting. In the 2000s with mites, mite control and breeding bees for mite control started becoming a big plus. So Russians and ankle biters, which are specifically bees that are, bred in order to control the mites, are a big issue now. So we also want to point out that in 1922, we stopped importing bees from the UK specifically because of Isle white disease that you're familiar with. And in the 1950s, we had Africanized hybrid bees. And it's really not an issue for us, but you do get hot hives occasionally, and good beekeepers will actively manage the temperament to favor docile bees. But again, sometimes you get surprised in the spring and you have a hive that's a little bit hotter than normal. So feral bees, going back to the question, do they exist? Yes, in some parts of the northeastern states. And I'm going to give you an update on New Jersey in a second. So feral bees are essentially genetically adapted to their location over time. Tom Seeley has written two excellent books. Tom Seeley, for those of you who aren't familiar, is out of Cornell University. And I would recommend these books and they're easy reading. And his focus was the New York Arnett Forest. So these studies are focused on the Arnett Forest near Cornell University. So the question then became, well, what about New Jersey bees, right? And essentially they're mutts, okay? Now, what Tim has told me is that he has not observed feral bees and their survivability as being something that's, where he doesn't think they actually survive in the state. So that's based on experience, not a study. One interesting element that I'm going to take from Tom Seeley also was when I say mutts, what we found through genetic studies, and he's the only one I could find a genetic study on, was a mix of Italians and Carniolans, 80%, which are the favored bees, is what we found. And 15% essentially is made of the black bee and Caucasian. So you can actually see from the 1600s that black bee is still lingering genetically in our bees. But more importantly, the 1% is only in the Africanized bee traits. So, And finally, in the southern states, it actually goes up to about 10. So it's in the southern part of the United States, Africanized bees are more of an issue. Okay. Local bees versus imports, there were questions about that. So where there is a favored movement towards having local bees, why? Because first of all, it allows you to have early, production of bees. Second of all, they're genetically adapted to the local area, and the survival traits are better. They're more adapted to your winters and phenology around your area. So, and there was a book that I just skipped over. That's a little hard to get, Practical Queen Production in New York, but this is still a very interesting book that I have. So uniqueness and importance of New Jersey beekeeping, again, very high variance in demographics and geography, climatology, and phenology. And there's a strong need for pollination. There's essentially a $7 million beekeeping industry in New Jersey. And we have a full-time state apiarist, which isn't true in many states anymore. So what do we pollinate? So first of all, we want to tout our blueberry community as being the blueberry capital of the world. And they also have a lot of bogs in the southern part of the state where they produce cranberries. In addition to that, we produce, pollinate apples and squash and melons and pumpkins, which are traditional elements. So our nectar sources, our nectar flow, at least for central New Jersey, I'm going to speak central New Jersey, really starts beginning of May and goes essentially to the beginning of July, really ends almost at the end of June. And these are many of the top sources of nectar flow for us. Maple is often too early and too cold, but the bees will be able to work it if they get a day here or there. My top crop, I think, comes from black locust. And there's also a lot of tulip trees and linden trees. And there's an invasive element in the August timeframe for Japanese knotweed that also comes out. So this is hopefully giving Shropshire kind of an indication of what our honey flow looks like. And finally, about colony collapse disorder. And a lot of this material is from Dr. Dennis Van Engelsdorf, who's from the University of Maryland. And actually came sources, the Cornell Master Beekeeping course. So what you found in 2006 is that colonies were suddenly collapsing. Few adults and no bees, kind of just abandoned it. The hive apparently, there were sufficient food stores. Other bees weren't robbing them, which is amazing to me, right? So, and something was up, obviously. And Varroa and Nosema were often below the treatment threshold. So predominantly it happened in migratory beekeeping, but it was actually impacting backyard beekeeping as well. So operations of all sizes were affected. So 2006 to 2007 was the main period of when this actually was occurring. If you were impacted, you were one of about 25% of the beekeepers in the United States that were losing or being impacted. And now this is the scary part. If you were impacted, you were losing between 30 to 90%. You were almost being wiped out. And so obviously that's not a sustainable beekeeping industry if you're losing 90% of your hives, but the average was about 45, but even that from a commercial side is very hard to sustain. So CCD was continuously reported from 2006 until about 2010. The mite control was often associated with the losses, is what they came up with, but there was no single causal factor. So nobody really knew. We're getting weird, correlations saying, cell phone towers are causing it or pesticides were causing it, but nobody really has proven exactly what caused it. We just know that it occurred. Today, CCD is not prevalent and only a few unconfirmed cases have been reported in the past few years. So thank you for your time. If anybody has any questions, feel free to email me at njbeeline@hotmail.com. I'd be happy to answer your questions. And stay tuned because Tim is one of our better speakers, and he is the New Jersey beekeeping whisperer, and he is going to tell you how to do beekeeping in a t-shirt. So you can't miss that part. let's keep going here. So I'll take questions from, if there's any from the floor right now.
Yeah, I'll just put your questions in the chat and I'll read them to Izzy. And Izzy, I just want to say that that was a fascinating presentation. I think even those in New Jersey learned a bunch. So thank you for putting that together.
Oh, thank you.
So the Simon had a few questions. He said, how come all the beekeeping inventions came from the top right of the US?
That's a great question. So if you really look at it, there's so much more really to discuss. If you look at Ohio, that was really an industrial engine for the United States at the period of time, and so was Massachusetts. And so, for example, I'm going to give you a kind of a fascinating, if we have time, I'll even play it during the break. There's actually a video of how AI Root was, from an aviation perspective, the first one to publish the Wright brothers flights. And he realized how important that was from a patent perspective. And so Ohio was, if you go there, was really the innovative center of the United States at the time. So the fact that we have this industry-driven engine inventing beekeeping elements, and also New York, where it had huge elements of crop farms, it's no surprise that northeastern element, along with Illinois, were driving the beekeeping industry in this part of the 1800s. So that answers your question.
Next question was, in the UK, we have an established series of exams leading to the master beekeeper qualification. Do you have something similar in the US?
So unfortunately, it's not national. There is, the Cornell beekeeping, master beekeeping curriculum. There is also the EAS, the Eastern Apiary Society, also has a master beekeeping. Several states have their own master beekeeping curriculums. There is no national curriculum or standard for the master beekeepers in the United States.
And then Ray had said, would you please send me your top 10 book list? But is there any other questions that are specific about the presentation that Izzy just gave?
Okay.
And
so if you want more, that's not me talking. We'll invite everybody this Tuesday to hear about swarming, which is such a critical part. Dr. Jamie Ellis from the University of Florida is going to be presenting. And so you're more than welcome to see that. And Frank, I think, is excited about this, the fact that we're going to have apparel coming soon. We're going to be opening a store with the various shirts. So if you're really proud to be a New Jersey beekeeper, you can start looking really classy in these outfits.
yeah, so just keep an eye on your email, because we'll be going out about how to order the shirts, but we're going to have a whole selection of polos, denim shirts, t-shirts, tote bags, hats, you name it. We're going to have it with so we can show our New Jersey beekeeper pride.
Yep. Okay. And with that said, thank you. And I think we're going to take a 5-minute break. So Frank, you want to tell us what to come back, or?
Well, how about we'll just say that we're going to take a few minutes. We'll be at 10:25 is we'll pick up with Brian's next presentation. But if anybody wants to put any questions in the chat, feel free. Otherwise, you want to just stand up and stretch, take a bio break, whatever. But the presentations will start at 10:25.
Oops.
Frank, who's up next?
Brian is up next, I believe, with Heather Honey Harvesting, and then Tim, then you're up.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry about this, guys.
What are you sorry about, Izzy?
He's muted, Frank.
Oh.
Frank, I've just shared my screen again. Hopefully you can all see it.
Yes, we can see it. Thank you, Simon.
Great stuff.
I'd like to thank everybody that did tune in to this meeting today. At max, we had 119 people attending, and that is comparable to an in-person state meeting. So it shows, even though the difficulties of this pandemic, that we are able to maximize our attendance, which I think is fantastic for a beekeeping meeting. So thank you all for sitting in front of your computers to listen to these fascinating presentations.
Hey, Frank, I have the video that I have. Can I see if you can hear the audio? You want me to try it real quick?
How long is it?
It's 3 minutes.
Do you mind if we wait, Izzy? I'm sorry to say.
Okay, all right. Kind of answers the question from Brian as well, you know.
Okay, everybody, just if you can hear me, get ready. We're going to pick up here in a minute. Brian, how you doing? Brian, can you unmute yourself? Brian, go ahead and unmute yourself and then we'll get started.
That should be okay. Is that right?
Yes, you're good now. Thank you.
That's good.
All right, everybody, we're going to pick back up with Brian's second presentation.
Okay. First of all, could I thank Isidore for his presentation? It was very informative and gave us a very good overview of beekeeping in New Jersey, which is a much larger area than we're actually covering. And we are beekeeping on a much smaller scale than you are in the US. There is very little, if any, pollination work for beekeepers in our county. There is in the south of England, in Kent and places like that, but not in this area so much. So we are as I said earlier, more hobby beekeepers rather than in it for a commercial perspective. I'm going to talk to you now about heather honey and the harvesting of it. Heather honey is, or could be likened to manuka, the honey that's sold from New Zealand at a very inflated price and is of quite. They say in this country that there is more manuka honey sold in this country than is actually produced in New Zealand. And so there must be some question mark there somewhere. Nevertheless, heather honey is a unique type of honey which is prized by our potential customers who are willing to pay quite a high price for it. There aren't many beekeepers in this country that produce it because it is much more difficult to produce than normal honey that we are gathering day by day. It's obtained from a group of plants which you might call heaths in the US, and I'll go into that in a little more detail later. But they are usually grown at about 500 feet or more in height. And on your screen now, you will see that there are some photographs of heather plants in flower on the coast. And then there's a close-up of a heather bloom on the right-hand side of your screen. The flowers themselves are very, very small. And so they're easy for the bees to gather the nectar. They don't have to struggle to get into the flower. They can quickly nib up to it, rob the nectar from the flower and go to the next one. So it's actually from the point of view of the bee, an easy flower to gather nectar from. But it grows at a much higher altitude. And of course, because of the climate in this country, the days are shorter, so that in good summer weather in this country, the bees can get up at 7 o'clock in the morning and they can work all day and they're still working at 8 o'clock at night. But once you start to get up in the higher altitudes, particularly in the heather, then the days are much shorter, starting at about 11 o'clock in the morning and finishing at about 3 in the afternoon. The big problem for that is that the bees know that they've got a shorter period of time to gather their honey in, and so their tempers are rather short. And so we leave the bees well alone once they're on the heather, because otherwise you're going to get a good pasting from these rather attractive black bees that we use here. Now, our main honey period, as I said earlier on, is really from late April or beginning of May until late July or early August. And so the heather honey is used for a continuation crop for some beekeepers in this country, because it doesn't flower until about the 2nd or 3rd week in August, and it goes on in flower until perhaps middle September. And so that's the time when beekeepers would be moving their hives up onto the heather moors to gather the nectar from the heather. Heather is widely distributed throughout the UK, and the next slide tries to illustrate that. I'm not sure you can actually see the coastal outline of our country there. And the red indications are the places where we would get good covering of heather. It's not quite as prolific or widespread as it shows there, but it does indicate that it's widespread throughout the country, except for southeastern England. So it's quite a good place. There is a strategy for moving bees to the heather honey, in that, as I said earlier, our main honey gathering season is May till July. And so the size of our colony expands dramatically from late May until July. And in July, our colonies are very large in population. And you may think that those are the colonies to take to the heather because you're taking a lot of worker bees up there and you're going to get a bumper harvest. But that's a fallacy. It's no good taking old bees to a crop to gather honey. You've got to take young bees there. And so you have to plan for the heather honey and either get a good strong swarm in the beginning of July, or a good nucleus in the beginning of July. Make sure that it's got plenty of food. Take the conditions that the queen is laying very heavily all the time and continues laying in August, so that you have a population of young bees within the colony to take up to the heather. That's the time when you'll get a decent crop of heather honey, not by taking old bees there, as I said earlier. Those bees are worn out through work during the summer months, and they are just waiting to prepare for their winter life, starting in the beginning of August, and the old bees will be dying off very rapidly at that particular time, and the colony will not be very prolific at that time. Heather honey is a strange material. It cannot be extracted by the usual methods. And I've included a description of it there on the right-hand side of the screen, which you may not be able to read very easily, but you can probably download it. But I will go through it very carefully so that you have some idea of what it's all about. This is an extract from an old beekeeping book produced by William Herod in 1912, although there were previous editions of it. And he describes the heather honey press, because the honey that you extract normally would be extracted in a centrifugal extractor and spun out. But if you put heather honey, or the combs with heather honey in them in a centrifugal extractor, the honey stays where it is. It doesn't move at all. You can't extract it in a centrifugal extractor. We claim that heather honey is one of the finest honey produced. It's produced from a plant which is called ling heather, and its actual name is Coluna vulgaris. It's not Latin name, and this is the common heather plant that we see on our hillsides. There is another species of heather honey called Erica cinerea, which is not as common or as good as the first heather one, because the honey is of thinner density and it can be extracted with a centrifugal extractor, but it doesn't have the same properties or advantages of true heather honey. Heather honey is a jelly-like substance, very thixotropic. It has an extremely strong smell and a sharp taste, which gets more pleasant on the tongue after a minute or two. But the initial reaction to heather honey is something of a shock at its sharpness to start off with. And it's a very prized honey. It's gelatinous. It's a rich amber in color and free from rounded granules, characteristic of granulated honey. It's a difficult honey to liquefy, and so you wouldn't attempt to do that. It's no good putting it in a heating cabinet and expecting it to liquefy and then being able to extract it in the normal way. It doesn't work like that at all. It would result in the honey swelling, running out of the combs perhaps, and which you'll be unable to collect and to jar it. We think that it is a pure honey if pure heather, providing it doesn't granulate. But of course, bees cannot be controlled when they're moving from their hives. So if the bees are gathering heather honey plus nectar from other sources, sometimes it granulates with the heather, and then you know that you've got a mixture of honey rather than a pure honey at all. We have classes in our annual honey show for heather honey, and whereas we might have 300 or 400, 500 entries in classes for our wide range of liquid honeys, you would only get perhaps 8 or 10 entries in a class for heather honey. It is not easy to gather, not easy to extract, not easy to process, but the financial rewards from it are good, because on the markets it will fetch double the price of a normal pound jar of ordinary honey. So from the point of view of income, it's worth producing. I've mentioned that it can't be extracted in an ordinary honey extractor, so you have to use a press. And I've used a photograph of a press, which I actually have, and I collected this piece of scrap iron for the simple reason that it is illustrated in this book of William Harrod's of 1912. And he goes into great detail of how this is the ideal press with a hinged plate in the middle of it, which will move out of the way. And you can put the combs inside that rectangular container, but they must be wrapped in muslin or a very fine cloth, so that when you press the combs in that contraption, the heather honey is extruded through the muslin covering and drains down into some container underneath, and it leaves the wax itself in the muslin. So you get rid of the wax from the honey in a press like that. Now, if any of you are in engineering at the moment, you'll realize that this thing is using a sledgehammer to crack a nut, simply because it was produced in the Victorian era in the late 1890s, and they always over-engineered things. And it just simply isn't necessary to have a press of that gigantic proportions to extract heather honey. You don't need that amount of strength to be able to extract it. The modern fruit presses are ideal for that purpose, and there should be a slide coming up in a second or two which illustrates that. This is a copy from the same book, and it actually illustrates the maker of that honey press, a chap called Meadows from in Nottinghamshire. And it shows that he was producing that press and selling it nationally. So there must be a few more of them about, I think, somewhere, because you can never get rid of a press like that. And so that's the interesting thing. These are the press on the left-hand side is a modern heather honey press, which is from the 1950s, which are just some plain board-like pieces of wood with grooves in them. And you wrap your combs in muslin as before, place them in between the serrated boards, turn the screw, and the heather honey would be exuded and would run out through the grooves in the boards. You have to turn the boards up on its edge, pulling the press towards you over a container of some sort, and the heather honey would run out underneath. But of course, the modern fruit presses illustrated on the right-hand side are much, much more suitable for that purpose. They're much more hygienic in their construction for a start, lighter in their construction, and yet you can apply just as much pressure in a thing like that as you could in the original press, which was illustrated in Herod's book of 1912. So very briefly then, the heather honey is pressed from the combs. Some of it may come from unsealed combs, and the honey always has a higher moisture content than traditionally extracted honey. We say in this country that the moisture content of extracted honey should be about 18.5%. But when you press heather honey, you measure the moisture content of it with a refractometer, more often than not, the moisture content or the water content is above 20%. And we all know that any sugar-rich liquid with above 20% moisture will ferment. And that's exactly what happens to heather honey. So you have to take care with that. We are aware that it will ferment. And so you have to store it at lower temperatures, because generally speaking, fermentation doesn't start or take place until the temperature is above 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you keep it at a temperature below that and considerably below it, perhaps in a refrigerator, it doesn't ferment. So that is really the only problem you would get with it. Of course, if you were a purist in beekeeping, you would only extract the heather honey from combs which were well sealed, and you didn't have unsealed honey in the combs at all. Although you could separate or sort your combs to make sure you extracted the well-sealed combs first and kept that honey separate, and then press out the combs which are not sealed properly and use that and bottle it, and that would be the first honey you would sell because it wouldn't ferment quite so much. So slight granulation or crystallization in the jar is acceptable, but if it granulates very, very considerably, then it's obviously has much more honey in it of which is not heather honey at all. The flavor of the honey, as I said, first of all, on first impression, is a bittersweet taste, but it matures on the tongue and it's highly prized and much sought after by our customers. So it's an easy honey to gather by the bees, except the shortness of the days because of the temperature, but it's not easy to extract it. It's a messy job. And so I would say that less than 5% of our beekeepers in this country would wish to be gathering heather honey. It's not common. And that's it. Are there any questions for that?
Thank you so much, Brian. Yeah, somebody said we need a virtual taste. Izzy said that. How does the flavor of heather honey compare to others?
It's a stronger flavor, much stronger smell. And as I said, it's got this sort of bittersweet taste initially, but it's very, very, very acceptable and much prized by, much sought after by our customers. It's a very nice honey. I've gathered plenty of it in my time. The bees love working it. I used to have an apiary which was 7 miles away from the heather moors, and yet my bees would be bringing back in August heather honey because you can smell it from 10 feet away from the hives. They really love bringing it in, and they'll travel great distances. I know we always say that the bees will only travel roughly 3 miles, but my bees were bringing it back from the only heather source at 7 miles distance.
Now, how much do you sell, like what size and how much do you sell the heather honey for versus how much do you sell regular honey for?
Well, we generally put our heather honey in 1 pound jars, and we sell it for 10 to 12 pounds for a jar. Ordinary honey at the moment is selling for between 6 and 8. But I used to produce a lot of heather honey some time ago, and I used to sell it 20 years ago to Harrods in London for 15 pounds for a 3/4 pound jar.
Wow,
And
that's great.
They couldn't get enough of it in those days.
So 10 pounds, I just did the conversion for everybody, is just under $14 US.
Yes.
Now, somebody asked, is anybody in your club sell heather honey that they could order from the US?
I'm not aware of that, but we'll make inquiries, and if there is, then we will send you their details. They would almost certainly have sold out their stocks of heather honey by now, but we can find out who is going to gather any heather honey in the coming season, and we could send it to the US, no problem at all.
Right, and somebody asked, do you ever use heather honey to make mead?
Yes. What we usually do in that instance is to wash the combs, which we press the heather honey out of, in water, and then measure the specific gravity and use that, because then you're not sacrificing the good income from the jars of the honey. You're using the leftover heather honey on the combs themselves. So that's the way that we would do it.
Now, somebody asked, since you did link heather honey to Manuka at the start of your presentation, does it have any of the same health benefits that Manuka honey has?
We are reluctant to claim health benefits for anything in this country simply because of the legislation that exists here. That if you claim something, you've got to be able to prove, in fact, that it is a fact. Manuka honey claims all sorts of health benefits, and it's graded. I don't know whether you're familiar with it so much in the US, but it's graded with different grades and given numbers. The higher the grade, the more beneficial the properties of the Manuka honey, and of course, the higher the price. So Manuka honey sells quite commonly in this country for 15 pounds a pound. But if it's a higher level of supposed benefit, you'd have to pay 25 pounds for a pound jar. But I would suggest to you that members of the public that do that are delusional in some respect or others, or other. They've got more money than sense.
Yeah. Is the heather honey only made by more experienced beekeepers?
Generally speaking, yes, unless a more inexperienced beekeeper gathers some by chance, and then they come to us at the apiary and they borrow our heather honey press to extract it. And some beekeepers do that because part of Shropshire goes up to over 1,000 feet in height, 1,800 feet in some areas. So heather honey is available, but of course beekeepers don't usually keep bees in this country at altitudes up higher than 800 feet. So that the chances of the majority of beekeepers getting heather honey would be slim, but some do. And they borrow our heather honey press each year to extract it.
Gotcha. Is there any other questions for Brian? A question is, do you sponsor honey contests within your beekeeping group?
Yes, we do. But I could have included all sorts of photographs of our exhibition each year because we run a major honey show. It's the second largest in the country. They hold a national honey show in London in October each year, and we hold our show in the second week of August each year, which of course is at the tail end of the beekeeping season. And as I said before, we could have several hundred, 500 or 600 exhibits of the different types of honey, varying in color from black to almost water in color, depending on the particular source that's been used. Black honey, for instance, comes from hawthorn or blackthorn, which you may be familiar with in the US. And the very light color types of honey come from clover and perhaps from lime. And so, yes, we do exhibit a lot of honey. We also have classes for decorative wax and other products made from wax, polish, candles, and that type of thing. And we also exhibit combs, which we say are suitable for extraction, which are contained in glass-sided cases. And all of this, of course, is very attractive to the general public. They will see live bees in observation hives, glass-walled observation hives. And as I said earlier, we do manipulate a colony outside in the open air, inside an open-top cage, and they see the combs taken out and taken to the edge of the cage, showing the queen to the members of the general public and so on. And they're oblivious to the perhaps thousands of bees which are flying over their heads.
So Brian, we also have a honey contest here in New Jersey. And the question is, how are you getting hundreds of beekeepers to make submissions for that?
We produce what we call a schedule each year. We could send you a copy of it, where we have all the classes detailed of the types of honey, the different colors, whether it's granulated, whether it's light, medium, or dark honey. And that is emailed to a wide range of beekeepers, not just in Shropshire, but countrywide. And we get entries from Scotland, from Cornwall, from all over the country. I'm not saying we get massive entries, but we do get entries from all over the country, simply because we have a magnificent group of silver cups, which people compete for. Some of these silver cups were actually made in the late 1890s. They weigh a ton, and some of them have been valued at £3,000 to £4,000.
Wow.
And they're all insured by us, and the exhibitor can take the cups home if they've got a mantelpiece large enough to hold it, and it's insured while it's in their possession.
It's great, kind of like the Stanley Cup.
We also offer cash prizes, of course. And we have classes for children who make things out of beeswax, draw beekeeping pictures, take photographs. We have a photographic class for both adults and children, and also for micro photographs as well as ordinary general photographs. So it's quite a large show, which has close on 1,000 or 1,200 exhibits. And as I said, there are 50,000 people that come to the show, and the show is held in very large marquees, and people are herded through the marquee looking at our exhibits. And of course, we sell honey there, large quantities. We sell perhaps 2,000, between 2,000 and 3,000 pounds worth of honey in that 2-day show, which is honey belonging to our members, and we take a 15% cut of that, which goes towards the expenses of the association.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Brian. That was, go ahead.
We can send you pictures of all this if you wish later on, which you could distribute to your members.
Yeah, it would be, we have a newsletter that goes out to the state. So maybe if I could encourage you or somebody in your group to maybe
Yeah,
do an article
I'll
on
reach
it.
out. I'll reach out to Brian, and Brian, I'll coordinate with you. I think that'd be fantastic. So
Yes, we'll do that. We'll do that.
yeah.
Well, again, thank you so much, Brian. We're going to now move on to Tim Schuler, who's going to talk about how the heck do you work bees without any veils or gloves? And just for our visitors, that Tim Schuler is the retired state apiarist in New Jersey. He is a longtime New Jersey beekeeper, and we like to refer to him as the rock star of beekeeping. So with that said, Tim, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, Frank. Hang on a second. Frank, my whole screen is filled up with the presentation. Is that the way it should be?
So you go down to the green button that says share screen at the bottom of your Zoom window.
Got it.
And then pick the screen that has the PowerPoint presentation. Okay. Now, remember, when you start the presentation, then you want to go to slideshow mode at the top. My slide. Yep. You're good, Tim.
Okay. Very good. And you can hear me okay, eh?
Yes, perfectly, Tim. Thank you.
All right, folks, thanks a lot for coming today. It's been a great session so far. I want to also thank Isidore for inviting me to be part of it. It's a real pleasure for me. So I'm one slide ahead though. Hang on a second. There we go. My topic was beekeeping without protective gear. You know, how do we do that here? As I've learned today, that the bee that they keep in England or in Britain might be different than our honeybee. As was already mentioned by Isidore and Frank, we mostly keep the Italian honeybee in this country. And I don't know if that has something to do with it or not, but you know, it's very possible to keep bees, and it's most enjoyable to work with the bees without 10 tons of protective gear on, in my opinion. Who am I? As I was already mentioned, I was a state apiarist in New Jersey for about 12 years before I retired. I started out in the early 70s. My dad was a Pennsylvania Dutchman who loved honey, and he grew up on the farm, and they always had honey. So he had a client that was a beekeeper, had about 4 or 5 beehives, and my dad really wanted to have his own beehive so he could get honey. This was back when sugar was quite expensive back in the 70s in the United States. So this guy, my dad got some equipment. We put the stuff all together, me and my brother and my dad. When we were little, I was probably maybe 10 years old at this point. And this guy gave us a swarm, and we really didn't know anything. We never took a beekeeping course, only looked at pictures in a book, really didn't read much, and just kind of started doing it. And it was quite funny because my mother told my father, you can't keep bees in our backyard. We lived in suburban Philadelphia. You can't keep bees in the backyard. Your one son has allergies to all kinds of stuff. So my dad said to me and my brother, look, don't tell your mother nothing. We're going to get a beehive and put it in the backyard and she'll never know nothing. And he had a couple beehives for about 1.5 years before she ever found out about it. So that was kind of a funny story. But in 1987, I took a beginner beekeeping course through Delaware Valley College. I had been working for the Department of Agriculture and animal disease control. That's where my college expertise was, but I always wanted to have bees. In 1990, I started my own bee business, and I continued to work for the Department of Agriculture in the Division of Animal Health. And then around 2007, at the beginning of this colony collapse disorder and this bee crisis in the United States, this position of state apiarist came open within the department, and I took that. And primarily that job was to educate and inform beekeepers and the general public about the good of honeybees, the problems associated with honeybees, and it was also to inspect beekeepers' apiaries for diseases and parasites, and to generally be an ambassador for the beekeeping industry. So as part of my job, I was involved with teaching a 3-day beginner beekeeping class. We taught it 3 times a year through the New Jersey land grant university called Rutgers University. And I taught that class for many years, and hundreds and hundreds of people took those classes. It was very common for us. It was 3 days long. And in the afternoon of each day, we'd go out into the apiary, and with just a smoker and a hive tool and pretty much nothing else, we'd have 50, 60 people. We'd open up colonies, pass around frames, show the students all the members of the hive and things like that. I also taught a semester-long class for the college for a few years. And I also managed about 300 of my own colonies for pollination. I live in the southern part of New Jersey, and it's a big blueberry and cranberry growing region, as Isidore showed in his presentation. And we would move our colonies at night onto those fields and bogs to provide pollination service for a fee to local growers. I retired in 2019 as the New Jersey State Apiarist, and my wife and I still operate Schuler's Bees, renting bees for pollination in southern part of the state. This is the way I work. I work most of the time. This was me inspecting some bees in a blueberry pollination setting. And as I already said, you know, this bee, if you understand its biology and you have confidence, you can work with it very well without a lot of protected gear. Do I get stung? Yes, I get stung sometimes, but there's days that I could work like this and never get stung all day long. And then there's other days that if the weather was bad or the bees were particularly irritable or had some bad genetics in them, that I would have to wear a veil. So I always kept the veil handy, but I really preferred to work this way. Why would someone do this? You know, some ask, why would someone work without a veil and gloves? Most important reason for me, more comfortable and cooler. You know, when you put the veil on, it just kind of makes it stuffy up underneath there. A lot of times I'd be inspecting bees during cranberry pollination. It'd be 95, 98 degrees, high humidity, very stuffy, very sweaty. And it's just much more comfortable for me to work without a veil and gloves. It gives me better visibility of what's going on because I'm not looking through the veil. In my experience, it's much easier to find eggs if you're just looking straight in the combs as opposed to trying to look through a veil. I've said many times to beekeepers that one of the things I love about beekeeping is that it uses all of our senses: smell, sound, taste, feel, vision. All your senses are used, and it allows me to better use all my senses. It forces me to handle the bees gently. I I've worked with a lot of beekeepers over the years, and I'll tell you, there's some beekeepers that are extremely rough on the bees. And one of the reasons they're rough, in my opinion, is because they have big bulky gloves on and their dexterity is not very good. And because they have a protection, if a bee stings their glove or stings their shirt or their bee suit, it really doesn't affect them much. So working without a veil forces you to handle the bees gently. It also teaches you the correct use of smoke. And many beekeepers don't have any idea of that. I've had beekeepers tell me they don't use smoke. They don't believe in using smoke because smoke can flavor the honey. Well, if you use too much, it could flavor the honey. And I do some developmental work in the country of Malawi, Africa, and there we've tasted honey that has smoke in it because those guys use way too much smoke. You know, when this one person said to me, "Oh, I don't want to use smoke," and I said, "Well, okay," because I knew that I could handle a sting way more than they could. So I let them open the beehives and not use smoke, and pretty much the bees drove them right out of the bee yard. I applied a little bit of smoke and worked them just fine without any real protective gear. So, you know, it teaches you how to use smoke correctly. It will also teach you how to work with the bees, not against the bees. And I see a lot of times people try to force the bees and work against them rather than with them. As I already said, it gives you a lot more dexterity to work bees without gloves. And then the other thing is, keep in mind, I was a state apiarist for the state of New Jersey. People would call me up and say, "Hey, my neighbor's keeping bees and I don't like it. I'm afraid," and this, that, and the other thing. If I went out there in a complete protective suit without 1 inch of skin showing, what kind of message does my attire, does my getup send to that person who's not a beekeeper, but is afraid of their next door neighbor who's keeping 1 or 2 hives in their backyard? That sends a message to that non-beekeeper that honeybees are something to be afraid of, and that's not really true. So those were some of the main reasons that I would not use that. The other question is, do you fear a sting? Okay, and you've got to get over that if you're ever going to be able to work bees without gloves, and then maybe one day be able to work them without gloves or a veil. You can't be afraid of a sting. Honeybees will sting. There's some pain and swelling associated with that. That's a normal reaction. The bees will mark you with a sting, so it's very important to apply smoke, because if one stings you and you don't apply smoke to that area and get the stinger removed, the more bees will want to try to sting you in that same spot. So it's very important to cover up any stings with smoke. And, you know, you need to be able to take a sting, and you got to get over that little bit of fear, if you have that, before you would ever try to work bees without protective gear. I don't know about in the UK, but in America, there's a game that kids play called Operation. And this is a board game with little things that have to be removed by the tweezers. I don't know if you guys can see the tweezers here. And if these tweezers touch the side of these slots on this guy's body, the buzzer goes off. And kind of working bees without protective gear is like the game Operation to me, because the bees will correct your behavior. If you're too rough with them, they'll sting. If you're smashing a lot of bees, they'll sting. But if you're working with them gently, using smoke, being careful not to smash a lot of bees, generally the bees in America anyway are very, very content to work with you on that. Okay. How does a sting affect you? I'm sorry about that. I can't control that phone. I'm sorry about that. That was a distraction for me. So how does a sting affect you? Okay. Normal, or pain and swelling is normal. Okay. You can train your mind to stay calm. I remember when I first took my first class on beekeeping, and started working with a commercial beekeeper friend of mine. Training my mind to allow bees to crawl on my skin, to crawl on my neck, without reacting was a very, very important thing to do. I see people, if a bee lands on their arm, they start twitching, really like, oh, you start jumping around like that is not conducive to working bees without protective gear. When you are not calm, the bees are much more likely to sting. And so you really need to train your mind to stay calm if a bee lands on you. Many times when I would teach those classes, there'd be a bee crawling up my neck, crawling up my cheek, crawling up my ear. The bees land and they walk around and then they fly again. You can kind of tell if a bee wants to sting you because they're buzzing pretty hard and they're coming at you with their abdomen down low. But if they're just walking across your skin, they're only going to sting you if you kind of mush them or you roll them or you rub up against them and squeeze them a little. They can walk across you and then fly away shortly after that. So it's important to be able to train your mind to stay calm if a bee lands on you. Those people are people that have bad reactions, such as severe swellings or anaphylaxis, really should not work bees without protective gear and an EpiPen, if they should even work bees at all. Now, I know some beekeepers in New Jersey who I've worked with many times, and they always wear a complete bee suit, and it's because they've had a sting in the past that sent them to the hospital with an anaphylactic reaction. So they still love bees and want to keep bees, and perfectly understandable. But if you're one of those people, you should never try to work them without protective gear. The other thing I would say is, when I first started keeping bees, my reactions would be, I'd have a lot more swelling than I do now. And regular stings over time, I believe, will lead to a lesser reaction for some people. At least I'll say that for me, I have very little swelling when I get stung now, and the swelling goes away very quickly. So, and I believe that's because I've been stung regularly over long periods of time. My mentor was Jacob Mathenius. That's that old guy with the white and green hat with the circles around him. He was the New Jersey State Apiarist from 1952 to 1990. And as far as he was concerned, no bee inspector, he would not hire a bee inspector that could not work bees without gloves. We would wear veils at times, but it was very important for a bee inspector to be able to take a sting. And the reason he did not want bee inspectors wearing gloves was because gloves could spread disease. And back then, our primary disease in New Jersey was American foul brood. So it's very important to be able to wash your hands and disinfect them if you got into a diseased colony. So, for my job interview, when I went to work for him, he took me out onto a blueberry holding yard where they were getting ready to load bees up after blueberry pollination in order to ship them to another state. And my job interview was to help inspect this large number of kind of irritated, disoriented colonies without gloves. And twofold, he wanted to see if I'd have any reaction to it and if I could take a sting, and he wanted to see if I'd quit, because that's a good way to tell whether a guy's going to stick it out or not. So the bottom line is I got the job. So I passed the test. And in this day and age, it's probably illegal to give a test like that, but that's the way they tested me back in the early 90s. So, yeah. Do you understand the correct use of smoke? That's an important thing for someone who's going to work bees gently and work bees without protective gear. As far as I'm concerned, the smoker is the most important tool that a beekeeper uses. As Brian was saying about using cardboard and stuff, I've had some people try to get me to use that here. The bees never seem to behave very well with the cardboard we have here. I've had other people try to get me to use those coffee carriers. If you went to a convenience store and you carried out 4 cups of coffee in those press board or cardboard containers. Some people like them. Never really worked good for me. pretty much I use either pine needles, white pine needles, or I use straw. And as I said, the smoker, most important tool. I would say never work bees without a lit smoker nearby. And I know Brian mentioned that when he was talking. Never touch a hive before smoking, lightly smoking the entrance. Honeybees are very sensitive to vibrations, sensitive to rocks coming off the hive, or over here in America, to protect the lids from blowing off in the wind, we often put bricks or some sort of a rock or a cinder block on top of colonies. Some people ratchet strap them down. You never want to do anything to a beehive before puffing some smoke on that entrance. And I mean lightly smoke them. I used to tell people when I would do beginner beekeeping classes, it's kind of like if somebody came into your house and didn't ring the doorbell or knock on the door, they just walked right in, you would be alarmed and you'd be ready to jump them. And it's really the same with the bees, in my opinion. So if you keep multiple colonies on the same hive stand, and that's a trend that's very common in America now, or at least in New Jersey. I noticed in some of the slides that Brian was showing, the bees seem to be on individual hive stands. And in my opinion, that's a good way to go. But these shared hive stands, you need to smoke every bee on the stand, every hive on the stand before you open any of them or touch any of them, because the vibrations will travel right down the hive stand. And I've seen people smoke one, and by the time they get to the end of that row, the bees are ready to eat them alive. So I'll show you what I mean by a shared hive stand. This is an example. You can see here, all these colonies are on these pressure treated 4x4s. And if you started at that end and didn't smoke the whole row first, by the time you got to this hive, they'd be waiting for you, ready to jump you. So important, if you're on a shared hive stand, to smoke them all. As I said, a smoker is the most important tool, and too much smoke is just as bad as not enough smoke. I've done, as I said earlier, some developmental beekeeping work with subsistence farmers in Africa. And I've seen them run their smoker where they get the bees so angry because they'll just puff smoke full bore into the hive until smoke's coming out of every orifice of the hive. Every little crack, every hole got smoke spewing out of it. And the bees get very angry and very upset with that. So too much is just as bad as not enough. Smoke is a tool to mask odors, such as a sting odor, or if there's strange odors on my hands. I would always smoke my hands before I open a beehive. So if I picked up any bad odors that was offensive to the bees, they would not be on my hands and my fingers. It's also used to gently move bees out of the way, and you can kind of move them around the colony or around the surface of the box after you take the lid off, so that you can get your fingers on the frames and be able to manipulate the colony. It also
than the old one, I think.
It also helps to keep the colony calm, helps to keep the bees calm. And as I already said, natural fuel, in my opinion, is best. The smoke must be cool. It should not be hot. Generally, once I light my smoker, fill it up, I will put the palm of my hand over the smoke, over the end of the smoker, and puff that smoke. I want that to be cold smoke, not hot smoke. I've seen people working their smokers with flames coming out the end of it, singeing the wings of the bees when they smoke the entrance. That is not good for working bees gently. That tends to really piss them off. And you need to understand the right balance of smoke. There's some colonies and some days where a couple of puffs at the entrance, a couple puffs under the lid, and you can manipulate that colony with very little smoke afterwards. But there's other ones that you've got to keep working those, or keep using the smoker lightly over the whole course of the inspection to keep the bees calm and under control. So you need to really understand that right balance. Here's an example of just lightly using some smoke. You can see before this smoker was puffed, the whole top of this box looked just like this area here. Frank, can you see my cursor moving around? Can you guys see that?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, thank you. So just 1 or 2 puffs, and you notice the bees go right down between the combs. And then if you just puff the end bars of the frames, you can clear the bees off of them, so you can pick them up with your bare hands without really mashing any bees or doing anything like that. So using that smoke lightly, not blasting it, but lightly smoking them. Some tips for working bees without protective gear. Avoid odors. You know, people all the time, you don't want to wear perfumes, deodorants, hair gel, and even some scented laundry detergent can be a problem. I used to work with a guy periodically, and if anybody was going to get stung, it was going to be him, because I think it had something to do with the laundry detergent his wife used to wash his clothes, because the bees always seemed to go after him and they never really went after me. So you want to avoid odors, perfumes, and as I said, all that kind of stuff. Wear light colored, smooth clothing. Okay, light colored clothing. Don't wear sweaters to go in the bee yard. Don't wear fleeces to go in the bee yard. Wear, just light colored dungarees, t-shirt, button down shirt, that kind of stuff, where the bee's legs won't get hooked into the fabric of your garment. Make slow and deliberate movements. As I said earlier, don't be jerky in the bee yard. You want to move slow and deliberately. You want to work your colonies from the side. You don't want to block the entrance. I see people stand in the entranceway and all the bees are backed up behind them. I've seen people just kind of mess the bees up by where they stand. Work them from the side, lightly smoke all entrances before touching the hive. The best weather for working beehives is warm, sunny days. I'm sure you guys all know this, but just take it as a reminder. Sun, warm, ideally the bees are flying, and even more ideally, there's some sort of nectar or pollen coming in. When honeybees are focused on a gathering of food, they are much less likely to focus on you working that beehive. And the hive should be in the sun, not the shade. In my experience as state apiarist, many people think the bees need air conditioning. They think they need to be in the shade. And from the standpoint of both small hive beetle and varroa mite populations, as well as working the bees gently without a big fat fight, having those bees in full sun is very, very important, not shade. Here's just some slides working bees from the side. You don't want to block the entrance. Late use of smoke. This was a nice sunny day, and you can see that's just a light button down shirt, dungarees, smoker, hive tool. I've done some developmental work in Haiti, and the bees there are, they do tend to want to put them in the shade in a country like Haiti, because it gets very hot there in the summertime. And these bees behave a little differently, but in large part, that's because they're not really using well-maintained movable frame colonies. We see a lot of cross comb in these colonies that you have to break apart in order to pull a frame out and inspect it. And that kind of contributed to the bees being a little nasty. We see the same thing in Africa. If they cross comb the top bar hives or cross comb the Langstroth hives, and you have to destroy comb in order to inspect what's going on, the bees will be much more defensive than if they're in a well-maintained colony where the combs can be removed easily. Here's one of my colleagues. He was helping me inspect some bees, and he's an older man. He worked bees without veil and gloves unless they got nasty or it was a cold day. It's very, very easy to do. This was inspecting colonies during blueberry pollination as well. So just to recap, some things to consider is, here I am. This is me collecting some pollen samples. We were doing a study on pesticide residues and pollen samples in different land use areas in our state of New Jersey. So things to consider: can you take a sting or multiple stings? Are you going to react, have a bad reaction in your body, or are you going to freak out and run around the apiary? You won't want to try working bees without protective gear if that's how you react to a sting. You want to evaluate the weather and the temperatures and humidity, you know, relatively low humidity, warm sunny days, warm temperatures so the bees are flying is a good time to work bees without gloves and that sort of stuff. Do you use smoke properly and in good balance, and smoke your hands, as I already said? Do you understand when to use smoke? I watch the behavior of the bees. If they start getting a little nervous on the combs, I'll puff them with a little bit of smoke. But if they're behaving very well and going about their business while I'm inspecting a colony, I don't give them any smoke unless they start warranting it. Avoid odors on your body, make slow, deliberate movements, keep a veil close by. I'd always carry a veil to a bee yard because there's nothing worse than getting in a beehive, and if one turns sour on you, you want to have a veil. I've also inspected colonies where everything was very, very nice. The bees were gentle, behaving well, and then all of a sudden a front comes through where the barometer will drop like a storm's coming through, and the bees can often get much more defensive when that barometric pressure shifts quickly. And here's the main thing: you need to really exude confidence. If you're not confident, that can be a real problem. I don't know that anyone's ever studied this, but in my observation or my experience, I think bees can sense fear. And I've seen people have called me out as a state apiarist to say, hey, I think my bees are Africanized, because every time I go near this one colony, they always get angry and they always sting me and this, that, and the other thing. And I'll go out there and work that hive just like you see me right here with no problem whatsoever. And I really think it's important to have confidence. Bees are a lot like dogs. If you're afraid of a dog, they'll bully you. And I think honeybees will bully you if you're afraid of them, and they can sense that. Okay. Do you understand honey behavior? What makes them sting? Generally, what makes them sting is, mashing bees, rough handling, trying to manipulate them before you've applied any smoke. In America, we have skunks scratching at the hive, feeding on the bees at night, can make a hive nasty. Sometimes some disease or a pesticide spray can make a hive nasty. You got to understand what makes them sting and how do they communicate. I'm sure you guys all know that honeybees communicate primarily through odors they release from their body. And they have an alarm pheromone that they will release if they are treated bad or if they are alarmed. And that alarm pheromone will get the whole colony behaving very defensively. We see that really a lot when I'm in Africa. If you don't use the right amount of smoke and that colony starts getting alarmed, it's hard to bring them back from really getting angry. So it's important to keep on top of them with smoke, observe their behavior, and keep them calm and gentle. And none of that alarm pheromone wafting around the hive. And honeybees do not like rough treatment, as I'm sure you all know. And when you understand their behavior and what causes them to do what they do, you can certainly put on a bee beard and kiss your daughter in front of the general public outside of a bee cage because you understand how they behave and what causes them to do what they do.
Tim, that kid looks terrified though in the background, So.
Yeah, well, that kid might be, but my kid's not.
Yeah.
And then here's the other thing. What message does your attire convey to the non-beekeeping community? Frank shared me this slide here, this picture of this guy dressed up like he's going to the moon. Okay, not one stitch of his body exposed. And if that's me, standing in a person's backyard saying honeybees won't hurt you to my next door neighbor, what message does this really send? As opposed to the slide on the right, this guy was the New Jersey's first state apiarist, E.G. Carr. And here he is back in the 30s and 40s, working bees with no veil and just some deer grass to brush them away, and a smoker is down by his leg somewhere or behind that box. What message does that say when he stands there and says honeybees are gentle and they won't hurt you? So that was really my whole thing, is I had to have this position in order to be an ambassador for beekeeping, where the non-beekeeping public and public authorities and zoning officers for municipalities would see me work bees just like E.G. Carr is. And that really drove home the message that honeybees were not going to hurt them or their neighborhood or their municipality. So one of the things Isidore and Frank suggested that I say is, what steps would you take, or what should be the logical progression towards trying to move in that direction? And I'll say this, I'll preface this first with, there was a fellow that I inspected his bees many years in a row and helped him out quite a bit up in Sussex County, New Jersey. And he looked like Mr. Clean. Mr. Clean, for you guys who don't know who he is, was a tall, bald-headed man, weighed about 280 pounds, solid muscle. And he looked like you wouldn't want to tangle with him. And that's what this guy looked like. Yet when we worked bees, he was fully bee suited up from top to bottom. And one day I said something to him about that. And that he says, Tim, he says, I want to start working bees without gloves. And I want to get to where I can work them the way you work them. And so this is what I told him. I said, first, try letting worker bees walk on your skin and actually use some honey to lure them. During the time when the nectar flow shuts down, put a little honey on your finger, go near your beehive, and they'll land on your hand or on your finger, and they'll start walking around. And you'll get yourself used to not being creeped out if they're walking on you. They'll suck up that honey and then they'll fly right back to the hive. They're not going to sting you. They're not going to do nothing to you. Then a natural progression would be to use nitrile gloves instead of the big leather beekeeping gloves. Nitrile are a very thin glove that will give you some protection, won't let you really feel them walking on you, and begin to get your dexterity up while you're working your bees, so you're working them much more gently than you do with those big bulky gloves. Then try just smoking your hands and working the bees barehanded. Learn how to move the bees gently with smoke, and you can do that even now. Open your colonies up and just smoke the end bars so that you can get your fingers on them without mashing any bees. And learn what too much smoke is and what not enough smoke is. You got to learn that balance. Picking up bees with your bare hands. Start first with drones and then move to the workers. Pick them up, just use your two fingers and pull their wings together. You can pick them right off the comb, put them right back down on the comb. And then eventually you'll be working them without gloves. So those are just some suggestions of ways that you can begin to, if you want to try this, to move in that direction. And as I've already said, for our friends over in England and Great Britain, your bee may behave differently than our bee here. I really don't know. So maybe it's not possible there. Hopefully it is, because I think you'll find a great deal of enjoyment from it. And this is my emails down at the bottom. Tim.Schuler@comcast.net. This was my son wearing his first bee beard. He was a little concerned there, but it went very well for him. No stings. And I'd take any questions if you had them, or if you wanted anything further clarified, please feel free to let me know.
Thank you, Tim. If anyone has any questions for Tim, please put them in the chat. I see that there was a few early on, but I believe that Tim answered those, so I'm not going to respond to those directly. One that did come up, Tim, though, that if you wanted to ask respond to was that, do you think when you're not wearing a veil, is your glasses that you wear enough protection for your eyes?
I've generally not had problems with that, Frank, but my friend John Gott mentioned to me last night that he always wears safety glasses, and that's probably a good thing, to give a little more protection around his eyes. It's a clear safety glass, I think with a rubber gasket around it. I generally just wear my glasses. If a bee gets between my eye and my glasses, I just close my eye, take the glasses off, and they generally fly away. I also would, I've had some health issues where I've lost some of my my blink reflex right now. And I've just ordered a set of prescription glasses that are in tactical frames that kind of wrap tight around my eyes to protect me from brush and sawdust and things like that. And I'll probably be wearing them instead of the glasses I have on now when I'm working bees this year. But generally that's not that big of a deal. But by all means, safety glasses are a good safety method for sure. The other thing I'll mention along glasses, Frank, is sometimes people that are older like me may have trouble seeing eggs. And I highly recommend clear safety glasses with a 2 or 3x bifocal in them. They are very, very handy for spotting eggs on cloudy days and for spotting eggs as your vision maybe gets a little less accurate as you age. So I would keep a set in my truck all the time, and they actually have the wraparound frame that comes tight on either side to give good protection with either a 2 or 3x bifocal, and they're only about $14 or $15, and they're kind of good because they give you extra eye protection for bees flying around as well.
Gotcha. Does anybody have any questions? Tim also mentioned the work that he does in Malawi, so this is a good time to hear more about his excellent work that he does over there as well.
Sure. Just I've been involved with an organization called Villages in Partnership, and I teach beekeeping to subsistence farmers in the country of Malawi, Africa. Malawi is about the 4th poorest country on planet Earth. And just the ability to keep bees and sell some honey is a great way for a subsistence farmer to generate cash for their family. We've seen their standard of living, the ones that adapted to some beekeeping, we've seen their standard of living rise considerably as a result of that. And I've taken a couple of groups of New Jersey beekeepers, actually one group of New Jersey beekeepers in 2018, and another group of beekeepers from kind of 4 different parts of the United States in 2020, just this time last year, to see what's going on there and kind of work with these same beekeepers. Villages in Partnership tries to develop relationships between villages in America and villages in Malawi, Africa. And it's been a very rewarding thing. It's also gotten us used to working with African bees. Now, they're different than Africanized. The bee in Malawi is the African strain or breed, and they are noticeably smaller than European honeybees. They are nervous on the comb. But they're more manageable than the Africanized. I've dealt with some Africanized honeybees in Florida as well as in Haiti. And once they get whipped into a frenzy, there's no stopping them. You pretty much just need to leave the bee yard because they are pretty much unmanageable, that Africanized. So, but yeah, be happy to talk to anybody about beekeeping in Malawi. It's near and dear to my heart.
Great. Can you repeat what you said about using the nitrile gloves? Can bees sting through them?
Yeah, they can sting through them, but they're less likely to. And the main thing with nitrile is it gives the beekeeper some protection, you know, but it gives you way more dexterity. So as opposed to regular bee gloves that are heavy leather, where you're not nearly as you don't have as much dexterity in those heavy bee gloves. You tend to treat the bees rougher than if you were using nitrile gloves. And nitrile gloves are a nice way to try to transition away from those heavy gloves to a glove that will allow you to work the bees and keep them gentle longer while you're working with them.
Great. Anybody else have any questions for Tim? All right, well, Tim, thank you very much. If you could stop sharing your screen. Perfect.
Thanks, Frank.
Thank you. Izzy, I'm going to go back to you now.
Yeah, I'm just going to play a very short video. It's a video from AI Root in their website. It's basically going to answer Simon's questions and showing the industrialization of, I guess, what Ohio was doing back then. And so let me know if you can hear the video. If not, I'll just stop right away, Frank, okay?
Okay.
All right, so here we go.
Nothing yet. Nothing. No, Izzy, we can't hear it.
Can you hear it?
No.
No, you cannot? Okay. All right, so I'll stop it then. All right, I'm not sure if there's a setting that allows me to play that. So always show video, audio settings. Let me try this, Frank, one more time, okay? So, and then just tell me if it doesn't work.
That she turns into honey. From time to time, rare individuals.
No?
Yes.
Oh, yes. Okay. All right. So let me put it at the beginning just real quick. So.
The honeybee is organized, disciplined, and tireless. She's also a symbol of wisdom. Just as the bee gathers pollen from many flowers that she turns into honey. From time to time, rare individuals gather knowledge from many sources that they eventually turn into wisdom. The founder of Root Candles, Amos Ives Root, was fascinated with honeybees. An intellectually curious man, his diverse interests matched the inventive spirit of his times. A.I. Root was the embodiment of the strive and succeed 19th century American personality. He was an entrepreneur, inventor, author, publisher, apiarist, visionary, and humanitarian. But first and foremost, he was a man of values. He cherished honesty, integrity, and like the honeybee he loved, plain old hard work. In 1869, A.I. took his newfound passion and established the A.I. Root Company as a manufacturer of beehives and beekeeping equipment. Between 1870 and 1920, Root shipped 4 railroad freight cars of beekeeping equipment a day. The Root Company's airline honey was nationally known as the finest honey on the market. To catalog his innovations and promote his discoveries, he wrote and published The ABC and XYZ of Bee Culture. Now in its 41st edition, this famous beekeeping encyclopedia has become the standard reference beekeeping manual for a worldwide industry. The Root Company stopped selling beekeeping supplies in 2004. Nevertheless, Root continues to publish the monthly magazine, Gleanings in Bee, published continuously since 1873. A.I. was scientifically curious about hearing reports that 2 bicycle-making brothers from Dayton, Ohio, claimed they could fly. A.I. traveled 200 miles on dirt roads to see for himself. On September 20th, 1904, outside of Dayton, AI witnessed Wilbur Wright fly the first complete circle in a heavier-than-air flying machine. Root sent an article about the accomplishment to Scientific American magazine, but they declined to publish it because they did not believe it happened. And even if it did, it had no commercial value. AI was dumbfounded. He realized publishing the story was crucial to establish ownership and future patents for the brothers. So he published the article himself in his own magazine. These brothers have probably not even a faint glimpse of what their discovery is going to bring to the children of men. No one living can give a guess of what is coming along this line. Possibly, we may be able to fly over the North Pole. Amos Root, Gleanings in Bee Culture, January 1st, 1905. An archival copy of the magazine is now in the Smithsonian Museum. It is a tribute to the eccentricity of the times that the first published record of this historic flight was in a beekeeping magazine.
Okay, that was it's kind of interesting because so I got to stop that.
The honeybee is
So it's kind of interesting because I work in the aviation sector. So to have the beginnings out of a beekeeping magazine is an interesting phenomenon. So with that said, I want to just thank all the presenters. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Simon, for all your efforts, and Frank to making this happen from a logistics perspective. I think it went really well. I'll open the floor up, I guess, to Frank and Simon and Brian as to if they have anything else they want to bring up.
Can you stop sharing your screen?
Yes. Yep. Let me do that. All right.
Yes, I just wanted to say thanks to everybody for joining us. If you have any more questions, you can put it into the chat. And I'm just put this back up to remember that we're going to have shirts coming. So just keep an eye on your email. But if there's any questions, just please put it in the chat. And I hope this is the first of many meetings like this that we can do across the pond with each other's. And maybe once this pandemic is over, we could actually fly some members back and forth so we could do this live. That would be fantastic.
Yep. All right, Brian, thank you very much. So.
And if there's nothing else, then I'm going to say thanks, everybody. And we'll say that's it.
Yeah, thanks very much for organising this. It's testament to see that there's still over 100 people on board after 2.5, 3 hours on here. So it's really good to see, and very enjoyable. And it's good to see the differences between the same animal in 2 different parts of the world.
Right. And
thanks very much.
There were go ahead, Brian. Sorry.
Thanks very much. I'd like to thank everyone as well. It's been a really good experience. We're in beautiful sunny weather here over in the UK. I hope you get rid of your snow quickly and your beekeeping season starts with a vigor. Many thanks.
Thank you. All right. So, and there was questions about recordings. I guess Simon and Frank, did you successfully record, and are we going to be posting it anywhere?
It's still saying it's recording, so I'm optimistic. Frank's also done a backup recording on his computer as well, so between the two of us, we should have it. I shall cut it up and get it uploaded to YouTube. It probably will take a little bit of time to get converted. So at some point in the next 24 hours, I'll send an email out to everybody with it on, and feel free to share it out amongst your friends, colleagues, etc.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
All right. Well, so concludes our first intercontinental beekeeping meeting. So thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of your weekend.
Enjoy. Take care. Bye.
Thank